rolling. We're anything but informal here. Welcome. It's nice to see new people here, and some old people here, and my wife's here, and everybody's here. It's lovely, and it's fall. Fall at Oxford Street. Upcoming, we are going to take next month off because the holidays and everything else in November were just insane. And we will return on the 9th of December, I think it is, and this how it will be gracing us for the afternoon. It's the now third annual Emily Dickinson birthday weekend reading. It has nothing to do with Emily Dickinson outside of it's right near her birthday. So I won't, yeah, you have to read Emily Dickinson and nothing else when you come in. But I'm looking forward to that. Today is Friends, and this is my favorite thing to do is to greet friends, old friends, newisher friends. I've known you for a little while now. It's getting that way. But Chloe came to me in a way that I just have come to think is the best thing possible, and that is, you walk in cold to a reading, not knowing who's reading except your friend that's reading in an hour or so. This was at the marathon that occurs over the summers when I first ran into you, and I'd seen Chloe because she was working in the library up at the Woodbury, even at that point, right? And but I didn't know your work. And I sat down and I was like, oh, it's her from the library. And about 35, maybe 40 seconds into the first poem, I was sitting up in my chair going, oh my God, I had no idea. It was a poetry that what immediately came to mind, which had nothing to do with anything you were doing, I don't believe, because we talked about this a little bit, was George Herbert. But it was that care and balance of the line that I adore, and that, marks us as, it's at once both, greetings, welcome, come in,
Hi there.
get yourself at home. Both, it's not, I've gotten to say it's not traditional, but it's of the tradition, and it's reaching back deeply into the roots of poetry and pulling it forward into our midst, and that's a gesture that I think is just magnificent. And then the other reason I wanted her here very much for a couple of years now is that when I started this series, one of the things that was rattling in my brain was an admonishment, I believe, by Elliot Weinberger, who at a reading here, and this is back, I think you may have been in charge of that reading back in the late 80s, early 90s, and Elliot had said, if you're a real poet, you're a translator, which really kind of called me out because I don't have another language. And I think, one of the reasons I started doing readings at all was, in addition to wanting to have a place where people felt, marginally comfortable and accepted being there, and not like you were somebody that had just wandered in and you really had no business being here because we all know each other and who are you, which I hated. But I wanted to make people comfortable and to let the community go, and so I immediately kind of conned myself into saying this was my gesture back into poetry as if I were translating something, right? But, we all know that the act of translation and bringing that other poet over into our midst so that we can actually experience that poet it's to be good, it's a rare and wonderful thing. And the time that you spend doing that is immense. And there's also, even as with doing this, you get called out as a translator and nobody remembers you're also a poet. And I get to be a venue operator instead of a poet or whatever. But so the generosity of that gesture of bringing the other language, bringing the other poet that you found into the language is no small thing. And so Chloe has been operating with all the burners going for a good length of time now. She's an actual whole person, which is wonderful. Children, husband, house, working as an editor, working as a translator, and unto herself a marvelous poet, and it's wonderful to have you here. Please welcome Miss Chloe Garcia.
Thank you. It was a lovely introduction. I'm going to start by sharing my translations of Shangyin, and just let me know if my voice is not carrying enough. He was a Chinese poet who lived in the 9th century, the late Tang era. He's very famous for having this obscure imagistic poetics, and he's often classified as a love poet. And I've been working on translating his work for almost 10 years now, and the book just came out in August, and I'm kind of floating a little bit. I don't really know what to do with myself. So to introduce him, I thought I would start by reading a description of his work by a 19th century Chinese literary scholar that I thought was really beautiful. And the scholar's name is Liang Qichao. What Li Shangyin's poems are about, I cannot determine. I cannot even explain the literal meaning line by line. Yet I feel they are beautiful, and when I read them, they give me a new kind of pleasure in my mind. And I included that in the book because I felt that it so perfectly described my feelings when I first read his work in Chinese, even till today when I was preparing to come and read to you. He has this push-pull between abstraction, imagism. He's very obscure and lyrical, and yet at the same time he has an immediacy of feeling that kind of creates a paradox that I fell head over heels in love with, and that love has sustained me through almost 10 years of doing this work. As a translator, my first kind of forays into translating his work was really to find out what was it that created that emotional immediacy in his work, knowing that they were written in the 9th century. So I kind of approached it a little bit like in shop class when you're learning about how to repair an engine. You take apart the entire engine down to its smallest component and then you rebuild it again. I was thinking as a translator, since I would have to be rebuilding these poems in English, I wanted to take them completely apart and see what were the techniques that he was using to cause those feelings inside of me. And so, the more I worked with his work, the more I could start to trace out, if there was no clear narrative, there was an emotional arc that I started to see being repeated, or certain tropes, certain aspirations that he had as a poet, and these started to help me go more and more deeper into the landscape, his weird and wonderful landscape that he had. So I thought I would talk about one of those tropes with you today as I read. So a little bit like that diagram that we're all familiar with from elementary school of the evaporation and condensation of water, where it starts in the ocean and goes up to the clouds and comes down in the rain back in the ocean around. He has a similar cycle, his emotional cycle in his life, which is that desire and joy lead to disappointment and loss, which then leads to bitterness and grief, which is then pierced by joy and desire over again, starting the cycle. And he is not a hypocrite. He feels each of these 100%, even knowing, full knowing, that the next cycle is going to overtake whatever feeling he has. So, since he is known as a love poet, I thought we would start there. And I want to clarify, if he is a love poet, which I feel a little bit torn about, he is a sensualist. He is a true hedonist, in that even knowing that his hedonism is not going to, is fleeting, and it's the pleasures that it offers is not going to stay, he commits himself full force. So there's a lot of alcohol, there's a lot of prostitutes, there's a lot of sex and sensuality in his work. So I thought we could start there. Yes. It's almost all veiled, and I should say that I'll start by saying the flowers in his work are both flowers and women, and often they are courtesans or prostitutes. Drunk under flowers. Chasing sweetness, I'm somehow drunk on streaming glowing clouds. I rest against a tree and sink into sleep, the sun already slanting. Guests gone, in deep night, I awake from intoxication, still clutching a red candle, in waning flowers, delight. A lamp. Bright and pure, never fatigued, to consume with heat, even unto itself it seeks. In blossom wine, in blossom season, it follows wine far. After rain, it sits at the rear window, extinguished. In the cold, the dark, a way station set in golden thatch. In the warm, the bright, a violet cassia mansion. A brocade bag conceals a famous painting. A jade chessboard gathers defeated pieces. What place lacks its beautiful dream? What person lacks a secret sorrow? Shadows attend the twisting curtain weights, brightness sent along streaming patterns of woven bamboo mats. My guest naturally surpasses the beauteous pannier. Now I am definitely mourn no longer. Yes, you should always maintain a half-lit flame for turning shining on shyness behind lowered bed curtains. Hibiscus. 2 poems. 1. A swallow's form is damaged by the strength of the wind. On the cloves, patterns of accumulating dew. Fresh crimson intermingled. To weep, to smile, the two are indistinguishable. Rather, there were no sister inside the moon than surrounded by clouds, a master. 3 pure spheres and immortal islands. What is the reason for your exile? 2. At Pearl Lodge, blazing fragrance lingers, after combing, brushing, jade rooms. A burning orchid serves as a candle, gathered brocade, never becoming text. What by nature is gracefully remote transforms to bitterness with distant gazing. I turn my head. I ask the winnowing gleam. The winnowing gleam grows hollow. So now turning to some of his lost poems. His wife, he died at 45, and his wife left him a widower with 2 young children. and because of his professional obligations, he had to leave the children in the care of relatives and work in locations very far from them for the rest of his life. So he has a lot of poems which seem to be about the loss of his wife. And the one that I'm going to read now is the first poem I've ever translated by him. The residence in the title was a house that belonged to his wife's family that he lived in with his wife. And this poem is a grief poem, so I could immediately kind of emotionally inhabit it. But what it really did that I thought was spectacular is it describes a particular grief, which is a grief that is so raw and so sharp that it can't actually change reality, but it can cause it to waver a little bit. And this then opened up an entire kind of poetic approach that he has, which is to use emotion kind of as a bludgeon to not shatter reality, but make it buckle and waver in weird ways. So this poem is very important to me because it was a window that I climbed in to do my work. First month, Chongrang residence. A heavy lock hangs on moss-darkened gates. Here, where I wander the deep halls and long pavilions. In the lunar halo, the first awareness of gathering wind. A cold dew has kept the flowers from opening. A bat grazes the curtain, ending my sleepless tossing. A mouse upends the window screen, startling me slightly. I wonder, silhouetted, alone, words with a lingering fragrance. Unaware, I am still singing, arise this night, come to me. This is another one that I think references his wife. Chamber music. Roses weep a secret pale, an azure sash, a tiny currency of flowers. Beauteous boy, childish as a cloud, embraces the sun, the dawn, through western curtains. The pillow is a dragon palace stone, carved in shades of autumn waves. Jade mattress, an absence of tender skin. All I see, silken emerald surface. I remember last year's spring, bitter affliction held in the mouth, no words. Upon my return, you were already unseen. The brocade zither outlasts the person. Today, a pine on the ravine floor. Tomorrow, a cork tree on a mountain peak. Agony, when heaven, earth are overturned, we will see each other, we will not know each other. So now, moving into bitterness.
What an Atlantic track.
Let's see. So the references in here that I should note before, one, of course, peonies are definitely a reference to courtesans or prostitutes. But also in this time in China, the willows were both kind of, a beautiful woman was described in terms of being like a willow tree. But also branches were snapped off of willow trees and waved at people leaving or coming back, because the word for willow is a homonym for the word to stay. And because the professional world at that time involved people being moved all across the empire to far-flung locations, there was a lot of goodbyes, and not as many welcoming backs. So that's the reference, the two references you should know. Rain Ruined Peonies of Huizhou. 2 poems. 1. Another year in Lower Park I cannot recall. Then suddenly, today in the Western Territories, we meet. Water pavilion, twilight rain, it's still cold here. A mat of woven straw, spring perfume, yet I feel no warmth. Dancing butterflies eagerly gather fallen stamens, and people, defeated and disappointed, lie down behind distant bed curtains. In the brothels of Chang Terrace Street, the flowers, the grass are friends. Go there. Ask how many branches were stripped from palace girls' waists. 2. The shallow may mock the pomegranate that blooms too late for spring, but flowers that wither before their time grieve a man more. A jade dish, weeping tears, repeatedly wounds the heart. The sudden sound of brocade zither strings frequently shatter dreams. This 10,000 li of heavy gloom is not that bygone garden, a year of living consigned to the floating dust. The dance of the stream before us ends. You turn your head. In that instant, noticing, today's powdered face seems reborn. And then I thought I would end the section of reading the translations with this poem. As I was putting together my own first book of poetry, I came across a cache of poems that Li Shangyin wrote about being bitter about writing poems. And they were such a gift, because I realized a lot of the things I was going through emotionally in putting together that book was nothing new at all, and it gave me such fellowship. Anyway, this is one of them. Oh, and I should say that one of the ways that poems were disseminated at the time was that people, your fans, would recite your poetry. So they would find your poetry and then recite it at parties, and that was kind of the way it got around. So this is a letter he's writing to someone who was a reciter of his work. Xie Fang of the senior examination class memorized and recited many of my poems. One day, I happened to send him this. At dawn, use clouds to conceive the lines. In winter, hold snow to divine the poem. On good days, the self is often moved. Though it's impossible, the writer could always be so. First, like the crane singing out from full sleep, resembling the cicada, shriek of desire enclosed. When composing, momentum never unfolds. To reach my destination, singularity must be achieved. At the head of the southern river, endless trees. At the western tower, shifting haze. Edits complete, everyone silent, still. Send it away down a road unbroken, unending. constellation of stars hangs to earth in the cold. River sounds ascend to heaven at dawn. If, dear sir, you harbor regret, let this poem express it. So, to shift gears a little bit, one of the byproducts of working on this translation for so many years was the word work that I had to do. Because it was written in the classical Chinese, I was sometimes moving things over into the modern, and then thinking about modern English, and then going back and digging into the roots of English, whether that be Romantic or Germanic, what have you. So I spent a lot of time with dictionaries, a lot of time with many dictionaries, and I started to keep these notebooks with just little facts or gleanings that I learned about the English language that I didn't know before. I started to kind of see beyond the surface of common usage in a way that I hadn't expected, and have things opened up for me. So once I was done with this book, I went back and started playing with those notebooks, and started writing these kind of essays, which were a natural kind of byproduct of the translation. So this isn't translation, but it talks about translation a little bit, and I'm using some of the similar muscle groups. And I don't know that if these are poems or essays, or, I call them proofs for a while. My newest name that I've really liked is Etymological Manifestos. So, thank you for listening. Whens. Remember when one morning we were home alone, and instead of letting me brush out the tangles in your hair, you asked to brush mine? Because you were so small, I sat cross-legged on the floor. At first the weight was too unwieldy for your tiny fat hand, and the brushing was more like being beaten softly about the head. But after a few minutes you got the hang of it and found your rhythm, rowing the brush roughly down the length of my hair, lifting your arm to the crown of my head, letting it drift down again, lifting your arm to the crown of my head, letting it drift down again. Then, behind the slow shushing of the brush, behind the curtain of hair hanging around my face, behind my eyes closed underneath, another side opened. A hallway into a wen of you brushing my hair when I was no longer able. I felt, just under the skin of my body, strong and capable as a mother, another body, weak and older, a self faintly felt of what was to come, not what was. I felt the weight of both of your hands, the baby, the woman, my responsibility, my caretaker, all in unison for a breath. And I do not say moment or second, because that implies a unit of linear time, and this was not of that rubric, but rather a transversal touching together of different times. I heard the sound of the brush, the sound of your breathing, the sound of the morning behind my eyelids, but in two places, 2 points on a life. Together, you and I, we had brushed open a lens. The reason certain moments seem suspended from the stream has nothing in fact to do with the present in which they occur, but actually is a result of the future and the number of instances it is recalled, remembered, replayed in that future. This phenomenon is actually just our future selves literally overthinking the happening in question, which in turn breaks down its structure, its constitution, like worn cloth or hollowed stone. This is the reason why the noise of life can sometimes silence itself, thin itself to one tenuous thought, like a silvery tendon spanning two dense slabs of muscled darkness, also known as the future and the past. Some people refer to this clarity, this one-note knowing, as intuition, which is false, primarily because it does not come from within, intuition, but from without. It is not a product of what you are, i.e. what you have become, but of what you will become, marching backwards. Wens, then, is a term for the tunnel between, the backward runnel which allows simultaneity to draw together, to bridge two distinct times. So in this case, I will be in a bed in morning light, silent under your brushing, thinking, backwards to that first time under your hand. Eventually, every life will prove the existence of innumerable tiny currents running like this one from the future to the past, even if they are largely undetectable and invisible, even if like lines of faint embossing, they are easier felt than seen. And experience of this phenomenon, a face you remember loving before you saw it, for example, is a clue one could use to determine that in this way the true future lies. To experience a wens is proof we live in a river that runs always, always. I've always thought that the best birth story I've ever read is that part in Huckleberry Finn, when departing his own bloody murder scene, he unfolds himself into a boat and drifts into a mist shot with voices from the shore, this one and the other. Because he was in two places at once and also neither one. Because he was between the shores. Because he was a bridge, or maybe better, he was becoming a bridge, because he was a wens. At least this is how it was for me when I reached for you, when you came to me, blind as a boat floating on the currents of other voices, the waves of others' touch, the deeps of pain, when we were both listening for the other, when I was a body of water in which you were surfacing, when I was the sway, the stretch, the snap of molecules, and when from beneath you rose, una ola, a wave, una ala, a wing. My own birth story, or the one that is not my mother's to tell, happened one afternoon several years ago in a blackout over the whole lower half of the city. I wanted to be home, and foolishly decided to try and navigate the lightless halls of my apartment building alone to get there. After climbing the stairs and muffled light from high and far-off windows, I opened the heavy fire door to my floor, taking a quick look in the gray of what direction I needed to go. But when the door shut behind me, it shut so darkly it was as if it had never existed. And when I stepped with fingers outstretched into the deepness, I was unmoored, eyeless. At first I refused to believe in my powerlessness and floundered forward. But with each step I lost myself a little more, feeling that strange vertigo particular to pitch blackness, when the borders of the body start to inflate, then reduce, then waver. When finally I realized I was unable to reach my home, and that I was also incapable of returning the way I had come, I began to cry for help. And after a few minutes, someone silently opened their door behind me, and an oar of sunlight cracked the dark. I found myself just a few steps from my own door, in a corner. I had been asking for help from a wall. For the rest of my life, as long as I am there, pressing myself against the faceless, unanswering wall of God, when behind me a door opens, a slight wing of light. This was a wens also, different type, not a bridge connecting 2 points, but the surge under the span, the flood. A decade ago, I was driving with my mother across the country. As we drew closer to the Mississippi, we began to hear on the radio that the river was swelling its banks and slowly spreading and cutting off all the passages back east. As we drove, we flew by empty houses next to the highway filled with dark water. Great mouthfuls were torn out of the countryside, and replacing that missing land was a waving stillness whose rising was so incremental, so unstoppable, it was answered internally with an equally black spill of fear. When we finally made it to the banks of the great river itself, wide as a small sea, we drove straight across its turgid waters on a vast suspended bridge. And just under the surface of that suspended moment of crossing, I carried another moment, when just less than a day before, in northern Minnesota, I myself had spanned the infant river at its clear source in Lake Itasca, so slight and slender I had put 1 foot on this shore and 1 foot on the other. A flood is just a widening of the between that causes a spilling of what was carried into what had carried it, an eclipse of the holding by what was held. Après moi le déluge, the French king says, and what he means is that he is the first singing sign of a reversal of the order of the world, another definition of the flood. But of course, we all can say this. The key is the word après, which yes means after, but also means below, and most importantly, beyond, the direction whose mercy we all float along. This is the moment where I admit to you that I have discovered time travel to be possible, and that I was ultimately taught this by translating the pain of a 9th century poet into English. To clarify, I do not mean that a body can move to a different time than the one they were born into, but instead that like a stitch one can gather not just all the shores the self has touched, but others that have been shown to you clearly enough that you may claim them rightly as your own. Let me explain. We know the way fiction works is that the words cause certain chemicals in your brain to go through a mirroring dance without action that makes the rest of the brain feel as if what is read is happening to it. The way poetry works is similar, but instead of action, it involves emotion. And this is where it gets a bit complicated, because emotion isn't mirrored or aped. Like light, it is perceived or isn't. And if it is perceived or felt, then it is original, inseparable from any other time that it is. So a man, burning in grief, can send an arrow of words forward in time, can through centuries touch, can prove that years are not opaque but translucent, and thus can let those words, like light, pass through. Perhaps this is why to write is to dissipate the gloom, to dilute the viscosity of the dark, because sometime, somewhere, now, someone else is lightening you. In the place of my childhood, floods came like lightning. They were immediate, a flash, an issue, an opening of water in the desert, an apparition made real. The rivers there are born torrentially like gods, whole and fully formed. Once, a friend and I went out to the arroyo in the spring after the snow melt to throw sticks into the whip-fast current that had appeared overnight. When suddenly, for a reason I no longer know, I stripped down to my underwear and stepped into the rushing water. I remember being hypnotized by the speed as I walked into its center, the way its force hit me, enclosing my body in its power. And then, where I had been standing, smiling, feeling the insistent push of the water against my legs, I was under, I was spun, I was thrown down, around, away from the air. Time moves quick as water when you are about to drown. Your flailing, your ragged breaths, just so many droplets forced to rush in tandem along. Greater force holds you now, and not playfully in the least, tightens its hold. Then, just as I went completely under, I was thrown against a bank, a thin, outstretched arm of sand, and suddenly I was free. I walked back upstream to my friend crying on the shore, and we went home. My mother made a fire, wrapped me in a blanket, and while I sat cross-legged, staring silently through the flames, back into the mouth of the water, she brushed my hair. Thank you.
Catch our breaths for a second. Gorgeous. I've been. Oh, before I've been. One thing I keep forgetting to do, and is to. There's a third reader here, and that is Mr. Thorpe Feidt, whose paintings are up on the wall here. Thorpe's, my friendship with him goes back decades now, and he's just an absolute wizard working up on the North Shore, and his work has, I think, he's going to kill me if I get it wrong, but there's like 600 of these paintings that are all derived from Melville's Ambiguities. And he just kept working them and working them. My favorite, I had a show of his back in the old reading series, and one of the paintings, if you think with the overtone of the ambiguities here, was about so big, and was 4 panels that were on Velcro, and you could actually pull them out and move them around. And they're these wonderful, lurking, ruminating paintings that, the one over in the back corner here was a wedding present to Isabel and myself. So I've lived with that one now for 25 years. And stuff comes out of it that you haven't seen before. And you go, wait a minute, did you see that? And so they just keep doing that. And it's just a treat to have him loan all these to be put up here. He's also a writer. If you don't know his writing, he's got one major book that he worked on for over maybe 25 years. It was one of those terrible writer's stories where it was all set up to go to North Point. They were going to publish it, which means it would also have gotten distributed and publicity, and he probably was going to get paid, and then North Point went bankrupt. The whole thing collapsed, and then it sat, and he rewrote it after that, which is another good lesson for us writers. He just kept working on it. It's called The Oracular Room. And for those of you in science, Mr. Claridge, Leibniz and Newton have reincarnated in Ipswich and are married to one another. And they're living inside this incredible room called the Geheimgespenstermacht, which is a demon that takes the shape of a room. So, you know, as I was working on this room out here, I kept talking to the room and saying, Geheimgespenstermacht, please don't let these words fall on me. You know? Anyhow, that's Thorpe, his paintings. Thank you, Thorpe. To introduce Carlos, it is difficult.
Pittella late.
Thank you.
There's even more than those names, but you can abbreviate as
Carlos.
long as you want. Carlos is fine. Too many names.
Our friendship has so many different roots. I mean, on a real simple basis, it goes back to he was in a workshop at the University of Coimbra that I dropped into. That was being run by the professor, also a friend, who had originally brought me to Portugal back in 1992. and where I met Isabel, and history spills out from there. But one of the other things that professor, and we can name her Graça Capena, had done to me was at some point after we had met, she had come to me because she was doing work on Robert Duncan, who she had found at Brown and fallen deeply in love with his work. And so we were sitting around talking about that, and at some point she actually asked me, so what are you up to? What are you doing with your work? And I started describing, because I had by then started the Book of Measure, I was describing to her what I was doing in the Book of Measure, and she immediately said, oh, so you've read Pessoa? And I uttered the horrible phrase, who? And she, you don't know Pessoa? And I said, I was saying earlier to Carlos, I pride myself, I may not have read, but at least I have some acquaintance with what's going on, Absolutely nothing, and I admitted as much. And she said, you really need to know Pessoa. And I said, why? And she said, well, and she started to explain to me, and I'm not going to steal your thunder, I'll let you explain Pessoa once you get up here. But, at that time, Pessoa had probably, what, 8 heteronyms? This is in the 80s?
Something like that.
At the most,
yeah.
And probably a year later, Graça walked in and threw a copy of the Honig translations, which was the only translation available in English at that time. And she went off to the restroom, and I sat there thumbing through the book, and as I've often said, she walked back out, and I'm looking, and there's Alberto Caero and Bernardo Soares, and there was a little bit of Pessoa, and I forget who the heck else he had as far as the heteronyms in that book. And I uttered the sentence, so which one of these is Pessoa? And she gleefully said, all of them.
Ricardo Reis, Álvaro de Campos.
Yeah, and you can't, if you don't know Pessoa, you want to know Pessoa, because, in my head, as far as major, if you want to get into that whole game of who's the big poets of the 20th century, there's nobody that's this different, this commanding, this early on, outside of maybe Stein. And but he, to me, usurps everybody else in the project that he was doing. And each one of these critters, each one of these heteronyms was real, and real to him, real to you as you read it. If you go through my books, you will find different people in the books, and ultimately, sadly, they all kind of still sound like me. There's certain tropes that it's almost impossible to escape unless you're a great master, and he is. And these persona have biographical material. They criticized each other's work if they knew it. Some liked each other's works, others hated each. It's just this incredible thing. And I remember this huge door swinging open imaginatively for me. And into this whole contraption comes my dear friend Carlos, who was, you were a poet and a student and working there, and ended up in the archives and has been doing work and talking incessantly. He actually talks as much as I do, which is terrifying. And over the years, we've all that are writing in this room, especially the longer you go on, you meet people that are full of projects, full of ideas, and usually full of crap. Nothing ever happens, It's just a lot of talk, and suddenly Carlos and his friends started producing out of the archives in Lisboa, and they were finding, how many heteronyms are we up to now? I want an exact number.
I think 137.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And then there's the whole crew of people that want to say, Pessoa was crazy, and he was, his mind was divided up. These are all real. No, Pessoa was a great writer. And so Carlos has been working in there, and to get together with him has just been tremendously exciting. And at the same time, he's also reached back. He brought Isabel and I down to participate in the launch when he brought I'll let him explain Uber Jennings, but he brought the Jennings Archive, which contained Pessoa material, to Brown University. And actually, in his great evil wisdom, brought me down to read the sections that I stole from the archive in the Book of Measure, and let us read those just flatly at the celebration for Jennings. So to have him here is to open this great treasure box of scholarly activity, poetic activity, and the thing that vivifies my imagination most is the deep knowing love that he has for this material, for archives in general, and for people working in the field in particular. And it's just a great, great, great thing to have you here at last. Here we go. Please welcome.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Michael, for inviting me. This is, I don't want this to catch fire, so I'm putting here too many things.
Looks bad on the record.
Yes. I'm a little bit a flor da pele, I don't know how to translate this, but after the how do you call it, melodical manifestos?
Etymological.
I heard melodical, which is, I like it because they're very melodical, and I feel like there are three immediate connections there. I mean, this is not going to be linear, just so you know. This talk is not going to be linear, but I feel like there's three immediate connections to me. My daughter is here, so it's very powerful to me, and I feel like I've been transported similarly in many ways, and brushing the hair is such a powerful moment. I feel like the second connection is that the 10 years, it has been now a decade that I have been working on Pessoa too, and I can't seem to get rid of him or him to get rid of me, which is hard. And I feel like what I was prepared to talk about was the connection of translations. And my agenda, what I would like to talk about, which if poetry lets me, because sometimes it takes a life of itself, of its own, would be to talk a little bit about the love of languages, falling in love with a language. And then I would like to talk a little bit about the history of this book behind me, which is curious history. And through that, through the history of the book, talk a little bit about Pessoa. Then I would like to read a little bit from that book, which was written by Jennings, and I'll explain to you who Jennings was. And then finally, read at least one poem from the four main heteronyms of Pessoa. So this is what I expect will happen, so you know where I am, more or less. And then perhaps we can open for questions at the end, if you guys want, and then we can do any of us. Okay, so first, I have been thinking a lot lately about translations and falling in love with languages. I have this theory, or perhaps I should say a conjecture, and it's unproven, that to learn a new language you need to fall in love. Whether this is with a person, with a place, or with an author. I don't know if it's a sufficient condition, because you can fall in love and still not learn the language. Michael's here, right? I'm not questioning his love. By any means. Okay.
No editorializing, please.
He's gonna kick me out now. I don't know if it's necessary condition also, because I mean I've been hungry in Morocco before, and I learned how to count in one day, because if you're hungry, learn how to speak a language, at least some of it, and you learn very fast. But perhaps you can say that hunger and love are similar in some ways, and perhaps love is a kind of hunger. And perhaps you can defend the other side of the equation too, that falling in love is learning a new language, but I leave that to the philosophers. I will talk a little bit about the learning a new language and falling in love as a required experience. And I think this connects us, not only perhaps the two talks, but also Pessoa and Jennings, about whom I will talk. And I've been thinking really a lot about characters that have fallen in love, characters from books or real characters. And I've just made a few notes about this. And I think this is an interesting way to connect Jennings and Pessoa. This is the first book, book in English, the first English biography of Pessoa. I can put it this way. I mean, even though we keep questioning if this is a biography or not, I consider it a biography. I think it's the first biography of Pessoa in English, written in English. Even though Pessoa has already 2 biographies in Portuguese and I think 2 in French. But it's interesting that it took so long for this to happen. But biography of Pessoa is full of these connections with learning a new language. And one of them is that his father died when he was very young. This is very important. His father died when he was 3, if I'm not mistaken. And his mother remarried the consul in Durban, South Africa. So this was a change, a big change in his life. And he almost got left behind when his mom moved to Durban, was planning to move to Durban. And one of the reasons it seems that he was not left behind was a poem that he wrote to his mom. And it's a very short poem, but it's interesting that it was basically love for his mom and poetry, and this all connected and made him go with her. And Jennings translated the poem is here. I can read to you both in Portuguese and in English. It's just like it's 4 lines, if I find it. And I think it's a good way to start. A minha querida mamã, ó terras de Portugal, ó terras onde eu nasci, por muito que goste delas, ainda gosto mais de ti. He was a child. To my dear mama, O lands of Portugal, O lands where I was born, much as I love them, I love you more. And he got to go to Durban. And he fell in love in Durban with English. And that's really important to know about Pessoa, because his first literary language was actually, besides his poem, was English. So he got always to see language from the outside and culture from the outside. And he kept writing in English until the end of his life. And you can see, he also wrote in French fluently. He composed in French, so he has a complex body of poetry in French as well. And until he was in his 20s, basically, he had more stuff written in English and French than in Portuguese. So when he came back to Portugal, this love of English, it was so evident, and you can see in his notes, he also made notes in English to his Portuguese manuscripts. He also distinguished writing and thinking about writing with different languages. At some point he was translating into English Estudante de Salamanca, from Espronceda. He was translating into English from the Spanish and making notes in French just because he didn't have English to make notes. So he was always separating, thinking about poetry with different languages. And at some point, he considered himself British, which is also very interesting, not Portuguese, while he was in Durban being educated. And he was very mad at the Boer Wars because he lived that in Durban. He went through that. He was there while Gandhi was there too. So it's very interesting to think what he went through. And he was so mad that he wrote a curse to Joseph Chamberlain in the shape of a sonnet, which I think is worth reading to you just as an illustration about how deep he was connected and invested in English culture, and at the same time critically thinking about this. This is a curse, I would say. This is a sonnet that is a curse. It makes you think of Milton using the sonnet for political purposes, but it has a particular power, I think. So, Joseph Chamberlain, he was originally written in English while he was in South Africa. This was just as the reports of the concentration camps set up by the British were coming, and people were not believing Hobhouse, who was Emily Hobhouse had visited the camp, and nobody was believing her, thought she was crazy, that these thousands and thousands of people were not dying there. And Pessoa writes this: "Their blood on thy head, whom the Afric waste saw struggling, puppets with unwillful hand, broader and broader. Their bought souls shall brand thine own with horrors. Be thy name erased from the full mouth of man, nor be there traced to thee one glory to thy parent land. But for us and for God ever do thou stand, in that thy deed forevermore disgraced. Where lie the sons and husbands, where those dear that thy cursed craft hath lost? Their drops of blood, one by one fallen, and many a cadenced tear, with triple justice weighted trebly dread, shall each, rolled onward in a burning flood, crush thy dark soul, their blood beyond thy head." It goes full circle. It's hard to read in more than one way. And at the same time, he's writing these poems with these mixed feelings about feeling British, being Portuguese, being an outsider, and also feeling like he has to criticize what's happening in South Africa to the British culture with this colonial war. And he writes a series of poems to the Durban, the Natal Mercury, and of course the poems are not published, it would be impossible to publish them, but in one of them he calls himself British. He starts by saying, "Our enemies are fallen, other hands than ours have struck them," and ours in this case means British. I think this is important to think about Pessoa, this idea of love of language, love of culture, and he was reading a lot during that time. And another important fact is that he got a prize while he was in the Durban High School for the best English essay in the entire country. And he had just learned English, basically. And he got the Queen Victoria Memorial Prize for that. And the prize was books he could choose. And he chose the complete works of, let me see if I remember this correctly, for Tennyson, Emerson, Bacon, and the fourth one might be, it's here, Edgar Allan Poe, if I'm not mistaken. I think it's very interesting, his choices. And he's still, these books still exist in his library and are inscribed, beautifully bound. And so, just so you can say so you can have an idea of his commitment to English. When he comes back to Portugal, he never returns to, when he comes back in 1905, he never returns to an English-speaking country. He never leaves Portugal again, but English is still alive. And his English, his writings in English, kept evolving until the end of his life. His latter poems in English are not very well known. Most of them are still unpublished. He wrote a lot of drama in English, and it's still very much unpublished as well. And part of what attracts me to Pessoa is that we are still exploring, still finding out who he is. Even though there are a bunch of anthologies that say Pessoa essential poems, it's not true. We don't know what is essential poems in Pessoa. We haven't read them all. There are thousands of poems that are unpublished of Pessoa in English, really. Some are fragments, but they're still, you can see, you can think of Emily Dickinson, the envelope poems. We have really thousands of those in Pessoa's archive still. A lot of envelope poems as well. Just so you can have an idea, in Portugal we have 35,000 manuscripts. So you can think of both sides. All this has been digitized, so 70,000 pages handwritten. This just in one of the archives. Okay, so Jennings. Let me see where we start with Jennings. Perhaps through this book. Has anyone read the book Night Train to Lisbon or seen the film? A show of hands. 1, 2. Okay, a few. So Jennings, 3. Okay, he sounds a lot like the main character of that film, that novel by Pascal Mercier. It's the story of a professor who has a very regular schedule, and one day he meets someone in a bridge, and he thinks this person is gonna throw herself out of the bridge, and then he stops the person, and the person was a Portuguese-speaking woman.
I saw it too. I'm not used to
Was
telling
you?
this right.
It's not you, right?
No, I saw the movie.
And he changed his life. He takes a night train to Lisbon, and he falls in love with the culture, with the person, with the language, and with an author. And the author is actually a fictional author inside of the book, Amadeu de Souza, but you think of the Book of Disquiet. I mean, there's a name on there. The story of Jennings it's uncanny how similar this is. So Jennings was born 8 years after Pessoa. Pessoa was born in 1888. Jennings was 1896. Pessoa was born in Portugal. Jennings was born in England. As a lot of 20-year-olds, teenagers, 20-year-olds in that time, he had to fight in World War I on the side of the British, and he almost died 3 times. Once his entire battalion died and he survived by a miracle. The second time he almost lost a leg. The third time, we think, I mean, based on the archives, based on what the family knows, some of the things are not very well spoken, but we think he just out of sheer exhaustion, he set up a grenade in the trenches and lost an eye with the shrapnel. So he got dismissed after he lost an eye, and Jennings used to compare himself to Camões because Camões lost an eye to a war. but this bothered him. He was very handsome, but with a glass eye for the rest of his life, really bothered him. You can see in his pictures, he's always like this. And he was a part of a generation of scholars, intellectuals that just after the First World War left England to far corners of the world. And he ended up in South Africa, which vertically is as far as you would go. And he got a gig at the Durban High School, which was a very, very good high school at the time, a reference high school in Durban. And by chance, it was exactly where Pessoa had studied. Pessoa was not there anymore when Jennings arrived, so they never met in person. Pessoa moved back to South Africa, had moved back to to Lisbon in 1905, so Jennings got there after World War I, so in the 20s, so they never really met. Jennings had an entire life teaching in different high schools. He became a headmaster of one, never at Durban, which was also interesting, but people loved him at Durban High School. So in the 1960s, they wanted someone to write the history of the school. And can you imagine an institutional book about a high school? How can you make that interesting? It sounds like the most boring book ever, and he made it. He made a miracle in that book. I didn't bring it here, but it's a very impressive book. It's big, but he followed people that had been at the school, and he decides to write 2 chapters about Pessoa. One of them is the first biographical sketch of Pessoa in English. The second chapter, though, in the middle of the book, is a short story. He decides to recreate the high school environment and puts Pessoa inside of the classroom. So, besides Pessoa himself, Jennings is the first one to turn Pessoa into a character, which is fascinating. And that short story is fabulous. I'm not going to read it today, but it's worth taking a look at it. And because of this book, which was published in 1966, people started contacting Jennings from everywhere, from Portugal, from South Africa, from England, from Brazil. One person who was from Brazil at the time, Alexandrino Severino, was very interested in Pessoa at the time, and Jennings and Severino started a correspondence. Severino ended up being a professor at Vanderbilt University and one of the first people interested in Pessoa's time in South Africa, so it was Jennings and Severino at the same time. Their correspondence is fascinating too. And Jennings sells the book, gets a stipend, and spends the money in 1966, with a trip going to Portugal. By chance or destiny, whatever you like, he meets the heirs of Pessoa, the surviving members of the family, and becomes really good friends with them. And they help him get a grant to study Portuguese. He's in his 70s now when he gets this grant. He decides to move to Portugal for he decides to go for 2 months. He ends up spending almost 2 years, and he arrives in 68. What's happening in 68 in Portugal and in Europe is Europe's going crazy, and Portugal is the year the Salazar falls. The dictator literally falls from a chair, and this is the beginning of the end of the empire, the dictatorship in the empire. Also the empire, but the dictatorship in Portugal. And Jennings is there. He has a diary from Portugal in 68, which is fascinating as well. He learns Portuguese, falls in love with the culture, falls in love with the language, and it's interesting to see the parallels. Pessoa as a Portuguese man who wants to become British, and Jennings, a British man, wants to become Portuguese. It's really interesting. It's noticeable in Jennings' writings that he notices that as well. And he writes a book. He writes the first biography of Pessoa in English that should have been published in '74. It was about to be published. And the editor commits suicide in the Carnation Revolution. The world is falling apart in '74. And the member of the government that was going to help make it published loses his job. So the 2 people that were going to make it happen, because he's not there anymore, he's not in Portugal anymore in '74. The 2 people that were going to make this happen, they can't, and the book gets lost. Jennings is very frustrated. Lost, I'm saying this metaphorically, but actually lost later too. He tries to get a book published in many different places, cannot, gets very frustrated, and decides to turn 1 chapter of the book about Pessoa's time in South Africa into a master's thesis. He gets his master's in his 80s. And the master's thesis gets lost. Actually, nobody can find it. I tried many times. Maybe one of you can help me, but it's been tricky. In England, I sent some people there. They couldn't find this. And people didn't digitize things and didn't think master's theses were valuable at the time, which is sad. Well, so he turns then the master's thesis, we know that, into a book. And the book gets published both in Portuguese and in English. In English it's called Pessoa in Durban. In Portuguese it's called, I will translate it to as Exiles of Pessoa. I love the title in Portuguese. It's kind of the same book, almost the same book. Translation changed the book a little bit. Funny enough, the Portuguese version gets published before the English. The Portuguese version in Portugal, the English version in South Africa. And the actual biography never gets published. And then he writes a memoir, 600 manuscript pages, handwritten pages, and then he eventually dies one day. Hubert Jennings, he lived a long life, a fulfilled life. His kid had two kids. One of his kids becomes a very famous geologist. I told you it's not going to be linear. His kid becomes a very famous geologist in the world, studying rivers that turned in ancient times. And something happened, some phenomenon happened, and rivers really turn. They used to go one way and they turn another way. If you know this, if you can locate those ancient turning points of rivers, you can also locate diamonds. It's a very valuable skill. Or like places where you're likely to find diamonds. So he become very important working for governments. This is before blood diamonds were a thing. Became, luckily, but he became very famous and part of a rush for diamonds in Africa and then in Canada. Became a very wealthy man, one of his kids. And at some point, the grandkids of Hubert were moving from South Africa and were emptying a garage in Johannesburg and found a few crates, like milk crates, and decided to move those crates and found Grandpa's papers and contacted their father, Hubert's son, Christopher, and said, what do you want to do with this? I mean, what do you want to do with Grandpa's papers? I don't know if they're valuable or not. We're not going to throw them away. So it was sent to me because there is a writer in New York interested in the history of the family. And I'm going to give it to him. Maybe he can find something with this, a good use for this. And then this writer, who's writing about diamonds in the world, he decides to Google Pessoa, because apparently Grandpa was obsessed with Pessoa in his 70s, and decides to Google Pessoa English scholars. He does a version of that, he told me later, and finds a few people. One of them is Professor George Monteiro from Brown University, a wonderful, wonderful person. And George is very interested. He contacted 3 people. George was the first one to be interested. And George reaches out to a person who works with me, Geronimo, and Geronimo reaches out to me and say, Carlos, pick up an airplane, go to New York. I was like, why are you crazy? I had just returned from a long trip, a 9-month trip. Like, I'm not going to go to New York. No, you have to go. I mean, just go, see what this archive has. And then I went. And then I arrived and I spent 2 days with this amazing archive. And one of the things in this archive was this book. Not this book, the manuscript version of this book. And then it becomes a long story about trying to get this donated to Brown. I had to do the first inventory of this archive. The family wanted to donate the papers to Brown University because of George Monteiro. And then eventually this leads to a lot of work, close relationship with Brown, leads to editing a special issue of the journal Pessoa Plural about the archive, and that's we did a colloquium, and that's what Michael was talking about. Michael came and spoke as part of the colloquium, so this is also an introduction on many parts of Jennings' archive and a lot of things that were lost in there, including this drawing of Pessoa. A lot of interesting things. I can't talk about this forever, but Jennings was the first one to do an inventory of Pessoa's papers. It's particularly important too, because a lot of things got lost. But if you have his initial inventory, you can kind of trace some of those things. He has amazing things there. For example, he has one short story in which he imagines an encounter between Pessoa and Camões, ending up with a translation of a Pessoa poem. So there's like all these magical things that came out of this archive, not just this book. But this book is fascinating. because this book is, as I said, the first attempt to really do a biographical sketch of Pessoa in the 70s. So it's a weird book for us today because it was written in the 70s. It has some ideas, there are some language that sounds obsolete to us, some theories that have been refuted about Pessoa. But it's a wonderful book, and he included a translation, an anthology of translations of his work on Pessoa as well. So it's a good introduction of Pessoa. It's an introduction you cannot find anywhere else. But then I had to edit this book. And editing this book is particularly tricky for many reasons. One of them is that when Jennings translated Pessoa, he was using editions that had mistranscriptions. Pessoa's handwriting is very hard to read, both in Portuguese and in English. So a lot of the original transcriptions had mistakes, and so Jennings is translating from a wrong original with mistakes. So what do you do with that? Do I fix it? And sometimes he leaves gaps and he skips a few lines because the lines were unknown at the time. So it's a little. I took the liberty in some cases to retranslate some lines. So I guess I'm a co-translator of Jennings in some of this work. And with his book was also interesting because sometimes and if I find typos, I fix the typos. But let's say sometimes he talks about a theory about Pessoa. Let's say Pessoa never wrote about his grandmother. It's something that he says. It's not true, but we've only found out after he wrote his book that Pessoa wrote about his grandmother. I put a footnote. But what do you do with his view, his worldview about the Boer Wars, for example? I mean, he was a British man who had survived World War I 3 times. He had a particular worldview, and that should not be tampered with. So it's tricky to edit a book in many different ways. I mean, if you have the chance to read the book, you see for yourselves what I did with it, what I drew the lines. And there's a whole ethics of edition that is different perhaps from the ethics of translation, and they are different from when you recreate something. And those limits are always tricky. I would like to give you a sense of his writing, so I will read just the first page and perhaps a few passages of his biography of Pessoa, and then I will end with some of the readings of Pessoa himself. Okay. His archive is not linear also. So there was the book, but the preface to the book was separate from the book somehow. So I put these things together. The dedication to the book was also separate from the preface and from the book itself, but he wanted to dedicate his book to Quintanilha, who had died, had committed suicide during the Canadian Revolution. So you see this dedication in the book as well. But I'll read from the author's preface. The author, in this case, is Jennings. Fernando Pessoa is not easy to get to know. Even during his lifetime, his friends remarked on a certain quicksilver quality about him that made it appear as though he was always slipping through their hands. Pierre Urcade, one of his earliest French admirers, has put on record that at one moment he and Fernando Pessoa would be chatting together in a cafe intimately, and at the next, Fernando had left him and seemed to have vanished into thin air. For those of us who have come afterwards and can only know him through his work, he's still the same. There still remains the barrier of his reticences, his pudor, and his sensitivity, and the constant retreat behind the masks by which he could both conceal and reveal. His voice seems to come to us from behind a curtain, sometimes so loud and clear as in the triumphal ode, as to be almost deafening, at other times as faint, remote, yet infinitely stirring as the music he puts into plenilunio, a flute that enchants heard more in the mind than in the actual tranquil hearing, as it wavers upon the air and trembles into silence. This is Jennings translating a poem. But each voice, and there are many others, is equally compelling. We have to follow. We join him in his search for self-identity. Perhaps because we feel it is a search for our own self-identity. Or it may be a game, or a ritual, or a religion. It can be any of these according to how the puckish spirit of Fernando Pessoa rules. I particularly like this first paragraph. Fernando Pessoa, this is from chapter 1. Fernando Pessoa was born on the 13th of June 1888. 4 months later, September 26, was born Thomas Stearns Eliot. The many similarities between the great Anglo-American poet and the great Anglo-Portuguese poet, as Fernando Pessoa was to become through his English South African education, have yet to be studied in detail, but what has been said about Eliot, that his major themes are the individual's isolation from his world and the problem of personal identity in relation to time and to intimations of timelessness, might well be said of Pessoa. Both exercised a profound influence on their respective literatures. Both were masterly literary critics in prose, and both were influenced by traditional occultism. So, Jennings is the first one to notice also those connections between Pessoa, Whitman, T.S. Eliot, and so on. It's a very interesting biography because of that today, because these connections are still not very well studied, because Pessoa has not been largely translated into English yet. Just last year, New Directions put a new translation of the Book of the Squiet. You might have seen, it has a beautiful cover. And the same year, Coimbra University put online the archive of the Book of the Squiet. It's a major, major digital enterprise. It's beautiful. And it's interesting to think of the Radical Scatters of Emily Dickinson, one of the first digital archives, and the Book of the Squiet archive. And then there are 20 years of difference between them. And then I feel like it's very interesting to think of them together. And Jennings opens many doors. They are still not very well known. So, if you would like, afterwards we can talk more about Jennings and editing, but I would like to get into the 4 poems that I would like to read to you. So, the first poem I'll read is by Alberto Caeiro. When I say by, it means that Pessoa attributed the poems to Alberto Caeiro. This poem to Alberto Caeiro. Caeiro was one of his more well-known heteronyms. According to Pessoa, Caeiro was his own master. Just to say some of superficial things about Caeiro, but they're important, he comes across as a shepherd. Even though the first line is, "I never kept sheep." He also comes across as a Zen master because of that. He's constantly thinking about not thinking. You can actually count how many times he uses the root for thinking in Latin language, pensamento, pensar, and it's almost all the time. It's ubiquitous in his poetry. So his first book of poems, because he has more than one in Pessoa's own universe, his first book of poems is called The Shepherd or the Keeper of Sheep. Jennings translates it differently. He actually has more than one translation of his book, and I tried to keep, for this book, his original translations. It's also complicated that because he did several translations of some of his poems. I tend to like the first ones better, and it's interesting because his Portuguese is still not great. Jennings is Portuguese, so he makes some mistakes sometimes, and when he does make mistakes and I can catch those mistakes, I use the corrected translations for those lines, but I try to keep as much as I can the first translations by Jennings. I think his rhythm is better, and this is subjective, but that's why I said I think his rhythm is better. He's not overthinking the translations, that's what I think. So this is from The Keeper of Flocks, or The Keeper of Sheep. In this book I kept the original translation, The Keeper of Flocks. And this is poem number 5 from the book. It's not long, but it's not short. It's 2 pages. It was dated 1914, if that means anything to you. There is metaphysic enough in not thinking about anything. What do I think of the world? I don't know what I think about the world. If I were sick, I might know. What idea do I have about things? What opinion about cause and effect? What have I thought about God and the soul, and about the world's creation? I do not know. For me, thinking about that is shutting the eyes and not thinking. It is drawing the curtains off my window, but my window hasn't any curtains. The mystery of things, I don't know where the mystery is. The only mystery is that there should be anyone who thinks there is a mystery. Whoever stands in the sun and closes his eyes begins to not know what the sun is, and to think of many things full of hate. But if he opens his eyes and sees the sun, then he can think of nothing. Because this light of the sun is worth more than the thoughts of all the philosophers and poets. The light of the sun does not know what it's doing, and therefore it is common and good. Metaphysics? What metaphysics is in those trees, that of being green and tufted and having branches and giving fruit in their season without any thinking about it by us who hardly notice them. But what better metaphysics than theirs, which is not knowing what they live for, nor knowing that they do not know? The inner constitution of things, the inner meaning of things, all that is false, all that means nothing. It is incredible that one may think of such things. It is like thinking of reasons and ends when the first light of dawn touches the sides of trees with a vague lustrous gold in which the shadows slowly lose themselves. To think of the inner meanings of things is supererogatory. It is like thinking about health or carrying a glass to a spring of water. The only inner meanings of things, the only inner meaning of things is that they have no inner meaning. I do not believe in God because I have never seen Him. If you wanted me to believe in Him, I have no doubt He would come talk to me and come inside my door and say to me, "Here I am." Perhaps this is ridiculous to the ears of those who, not knowing what it is to look at things, do not understand anyone who speaks of them in that manner of speaking that the art of observing them teaches. But if God is the flowers and the trees and mountain and sun and moonlight, then I believe in Him. I believe in Him all the time. And all my life is one oration and mass and one communion with eyes and ears. But if God is flowers and trees and mountain and moonlight and sun, why should I call Him God? I call Him flowers and trees and mountain and sun and moonlight, because if He made Himself for me to see into sun and moonlight and flowers and trees and mountains, if He appears to me as being trees and mountains and moonlight and sun and flowers, it is because He wants me to know Him as trees and mountains and flowers and moonlight and sun. And therefore I obey Him. What more of God should I know than God Himself? I obey Him and live spontaneously as one who opens his eyes and sees, and I call Him moonlight and sun and flowers and trees and mountains, and I love Him without thinking of Him, and I think of Him by seeing and hearing, and I walk with Him every hour. This is Alberto Caeiro. You get a sense of why he's called Zen Master or God. According to Pessoa, actually, according to Ricardo Reis, who is another heteronym of Pessoa and wrote the preface to Caeiro's book of poems, Caeiro was not pagan. He was Pan himself incarnate. We'll get to read one poem by Ricardo Reis, but the order in which they were created were Caeiro, then Álvaro de Campos, who is perhaps the most well-known, then Ricardo Reis, and then Pessoa himself. And then you also have what Pessoa calls semi-heteronym, who is Bernardo Wichel, who is even hard to say, but which pronoun to use. But Pessoa invented Bernardo Soares, who is the author of the Book of Disquiet, but Pessoa calls him a semi-heteronym, because his personality is not completely independent from Pessoa's, but only a mutilation of his. He says that Bernardo Soares is himself with less reason, because he always wrote the Book of Disquiet when he was really tired. So it's not really an independent personality, it's just a mutilation of his own. So he calls him semi-heteronym. Pessoa himself only used the word heteronym for Cairo, Campos, and Reis. The other ones, he never called heteronyms. But we can call them fictional authors, but this word has been extended. He actually never used the word heteronymy, he used heteronymism in Portuguese, which is interesting too. Just, I don't know, I mean, just words are important, but they also have a life of their own, right? Campos is a disciple of Cairo, as Pessoa himself is, and Ricardo Reis also is. Campos, he had a poetry before Cairo as well. Of course, Pessoa wrote this poetry after he invented Cairo, but he retrospectively, I don't know if this is right adverb to use, but he invented Cairo's poetry from when Cairo still did not know, he invented Campos' poetry from Campos still did not know Cairo. So his poetry is very different. Campos' poetry before he met Cairo had rhymes, was full of opium, and actually it looked a lot like Mário de Sá Carneiro's poetry. Mário de Sá Carneiro is a real person, friend, well, his body's real, but he was a flesh and blood person, good friend of Pessoa, who also committed suicide. One of the reasons we think Pessoa invented Cairo, the 10, whose poem I just read, we think is that Pessoa wanted to heal metaphorically his friend, and he wanted to show his friend that a different kind of poetry was possible by illustrating it. So he made Campos look a lot like Sá Carneiro, and then changed his poetry after meeting. I mean, there's so many names, but I know I'm lost, so I guess you are too. But he illustrated healing through poetry by inventing Cairo, basically. So this is Campos' poetry from after he met Cairo. And one of my favorite poems by Campos, and luckily Jennings translated the entire thing in fabulously, is The Tobacco Shop. This is actually a long poem. But then Ricardo Reis' poems are very short, and Pessoa's are very short as well. So this is the only long one. I printed half of it for you. It's still long to print it all. So I have you pass around. You can follow the first part, and then you can close your eyes if you wish, or you can buy the book to read the rest. But I'll give you a few. And can I give you some? Let me see. Yes. In one side you have part of the poem, and the other side you have a manuscript of Pessoa, and I'll talk about the manuscript after. I still have one. I have a few. A few more. Perhaps send back this side a few more. Alright. So, The Tobacco Shop. Tabacaria in Portuguese. It's not the longest poem by Campos. Campos has an actual long poem that goes through 30 pages or more called the Maritime Ode, or the Naval Ode. It also has the Triumph Ode, which is very long, so it's not the longest, not even close to the longest ones, but I'm not going to talk a lot about the poem after, but to me I always think of Bruff Rock, and it's interesting. I haven't seen anything written about Bruff Rock in this poem yet, but perhaps one of you will. The Tobacco Shop. I am nothing. I shall never be anything. I cannot wish to be anything. Apart from that, I have in me all the dreams of the world. The windows of my room, the room of one among millions in the world who no one knows. But if one knew, what would one know? Look out on the mystery of a road constantly crossed by people, on a street inaccessible to all thought, real, impossibly real, certain, unrecognizably certain, with the mystery of things set deep in the stones and the people, and death to make humid the walls and white the heads of men, and destiny to drive a tumbril with all through the road of nothing. Today I am one, as if I knew the truth. Today I'm lucid, as if I knew I were about to die, and I didn't have any more kinship with things, besides a farewell with this house and this side of the street becoming the line of carriages of a train, and a whistled departure from inside my head, and a little quiver of my nerves, and a sudden grinding of bones while going. Today I am perplexed, like one who has thought, discovered, and forgot. I am, this day, divided between the loyalty I owe to the tobacco shop on the other side of the road as something real outside of me, and the sensation that always dreamed as something real within me. I failed in everything. As I had no purpose whatever, perhaps that too was nothing. The apprenticeship that was given me, I threw out of the back window of the house. I went into the country with fine plans, but there found only grass and trees. And when there were people, they were not much different. I leave the window and go sit in a chair. What shall I think about? What do I know about what I shall be? I, who do not know what I am. Shall I be what I think? But I think of being so many things, and there are so many who think of being the same thing that there could not be so many. Genius? At this moment 100,000 brains are dreaming they are geniuses like me, and history will not, who knows, record a single one, nor anything will be left but the dead of so many future conquests. No, I do not believe in myself. In all the madhouses of the world there are lunatics crazed with convictions like that. I, who have no such certainty, am I more certain or less certain? No, not of myself. In how many garrets and not garrets in this world are there not self-imagined geniuses dreaming? How many high and noble and lucid aspirations, yes, truly high and noble and lucid, and who knows if realizable, may never see the light of day or reach the ears of people. The world is for him who was born to conquer it, not for him who dreams he could conquer it, even if he were right. I have dreamed more dreams than Napoleon did. I have clasped to my hypothetic breast more of humanity than Christ did. I have made philosophies in secret that no Kant ever wrote. But I am, and always will be, the one in a garret, though I don't live in one. I shall always be one who was not born for this. I shall always be the one who had qualities. I shall always be the one who hoped that a door would open for him in a wall without doors, who sang the hymn of the infinite in a hen house and heard the voice of God in a shut-down well. Believe in myself? No, nor in anything. Nature poured down upon my burning head its sun, its rain, and the wind that sweeps through my hair, and the rest that might happen, or ought to happen, or does not happen. Cardiac slaves of the stars, we conquer the world while still in bed. But when we awake, it has gone opaque. We get up, and it is alien to us. We go out, and it is the whole world and the solar system, the Milky Way, and infinity as well. Have some chocolates, little one. Have some chocolates. Chocolates. Look, there's nothing more metaphysical in the world than chocolates. None of the religions teaches more than confectionery. Have some chocolates, grimy little girl. If only I could eat chocolates with the same truth as you do. But I think, and when I tear off the silver paper, which is really tin foil, I throw it all on the ground as I have thrown away my life. But at least remains the bitterness of what I will never be. The quick calligraphy of these verses, broken portal to the impossible. But at least I consecrate myself to a tearless despise, noble at least in the broad gesture with which I throw the dirty clothes I am, without inventory, to the stream of things and stay home shirtless. You, who consoles, who does not exist and thus consoles, either Greek goddess conceived as a living statue, or Roman patrician impossibly noble and nefarious, or princess of troubadours gentlest and colorful, or marchioness of the 18th century, décolleté and remote, or celebrated cocotte from the time of our parents, or I don't know what of modern, I can't quite envision what. All this, whatever it is that you are, if you can inspire, then do inspire. My heart is a poured out bucket. Just like those who invoke spirits, I invoke myself and find nothing. I approach the window and see the street with absolute clarity. I see the stores, the public walks, the passing cars. I see the dressed living beings who cross each other. I see the dogs who also exist. And all this weighs on me like a condemnation to exile. And all this is foreign as everything. I have studied, lived, loved, and even believed. And now there is no beggar I do not envy just because he is not I. I look at the rags and the sores and the lies of each one and think, perhaps you might never have lived, studied, loved, or believed, because it is possible to make reality out of this without making anything out of it. Perhaps you only existed like a lizard whose tail has been cut off and sees the tail wriggling frantically beside it. I made of myself what I could not be, and what I could not do with myself, I did not do. I put on the wrong domino. Others then took me for what I was not, and I did not belie it, but effaced myself. When I wanted to take off the mask, it was glued to my face. When I did get it off and looked at myself in the mirror, I had become old. I was drunk, and now I could not put on again the domino I had taken off. I threw away the mask and slept in the cloakroom like a dog, tolerated by the management because it is harmless. And I am now writing the story to show how sublime I am. Musical essence of my useless verses, how I would like to find in you something that I had made and not to remain always in front of the tobacco shop over there, getting my feet tangled up with the awareness of existence, like a carpet on which a drunkard is stumbling, or a doormat worth nothing that gypsies had stolen. Then the owner of the tobacco shop came to the door and stayed there. I eye him with the discomfort of a head askew and all the discomfort of a half-understanding mind. He will die, and I will die. He will leave a shop sign, I will leave verses. In due time the shop sign will die too, and so will my verses. After a time the street where the sign was will die too, and the language in which my verses were written. Later on will die too the revolving planet where all these took place. In other satellites of other systems, something like people will go on making things like verses and living under things like shop signs. Always one thing facing the other, always one thing as futile as the other, always the impossible as stupid as the real, always the mystery of the profound as certain as the slumbering mystery in the superficial, always this or something else, or neither one thing nor the other. Now a man has entered the tobacco shop to buy tobacco, and plausible reality suddenly falls down upon me. I straighten up, full of energy, assured and human, and I make up my mind to write these verses where I say the opposite. I light a cigarette while thinking about writing them, and in the cigarette I taste the freeing of all my thoughts. I follow the smoke as if it were a path for me, and I enjoy, in a sensitive and competent moment, a liberation from all speculation and a consciousness that metaphysics is a consequence of being sick. Then I throw myself back on the chair and go on smoking. As long as destiny allows, I will go on smoking. If I married the daughter of my washerwoman, perhaps I would be happy. This being so, I get up from the chair, I go to the window. The man has come out of the tobacco shop, putting the change into his trouser pocket. Yeah, I know him. It is the non-metaphysical Steve. The owner of the tobacco shop has come to the door. By some divine instinct, Steve has turned and seen me. He waves to me and I shout to him, "So long, Steve!" And the universe has reconstructed itself without ideals or hope, and the owner of the tobacco shop smiled. We're missing only one heteronym. This is a short one. This is by Ricardo Reis. It's also, well, the one I just read was from 1928. This one's from 1914, as the first poem. This is Ricardo Reis. He's very different from Cairo and from Campos. You can notice that in terms of form as well. Campos free verse, this long one. Cairo is almost poetic prose. He says he doesn't write verse, he says he writes in prose. Cairo. Campos, he only writes in odes, in classic odes. And they are very, very rigid in Portuguese. Campos thinks Ricardo Reis is an idiot, like why does he write in rigid verse? I mean, and Ricardo Reis thinks Campos is an idiot, like he doesn't know anything about rhythm or metrics. Anyway, so they argue all the time. Anyways, Ricardo Reis, when the monarchy, and when Portugal becomes democracy, well, a republic, not a democracy, they thought it would become a democracy, but it becomes a republic and then a dictatorship. When it becomes a republic, Ricardo Reis is so pissed off that he moves to Brazil. And he stays in Brazil, and then Saramago, a real person, as you know, brings Ricardo Reis back to Portugal in his great novel, One of the Mortes de Ricardo Reis, the year of the death of Ricardo Reis, because Pessoa dies, and like, what's going to happen to Ricardo Reis? I mean, he's a heteronym, so he goes back to Portugal, and then interesting things happen. It's a great novel, if you guys would like to read it. Well, so this is Ricardo Reis, one of his odes to Cairo. All these have been translations by Jennings into English. They all have been written in Portuguese originally. Master, how placid are the hours which we waste, when we waste them, as into a vase we put flowers. There is no sadness nor happiness in our lives, if thus we are able, wise dupes, not to live, but let life lapse, tranquil and placid, taking children as our masters, and with eaves filled from nature. By a river's banks or beside a road, fittingly silent, always in the same light restfulness of being alive. Time passes. To us, it means nothing. We grow old, and we can almost mockingly feel ourselves go. It is not worthwhile to make one gesture, nor to resist the hateful God whoever his own sons devours. Let us gather flowers, and in calm rivers let us lightly wet our hands, so that we from the rivers may learn to be calm. Some flowers ever, watching the sun, tranquilly from life we will go, having not even the regret from having lived. You get a taste of Ricardo Reis that way. And then there's Pessoa, or Pessoas. There's so many. There's Pessoa in Portuguese, Pessoa in French, Pessoa in English. I think you should do at least two very short ones. One, you have it, but I went with that one that you have. Pessoa only published one book in his lifetime. He actually published 4 chapbooks in English, which is very interesting. He published in Portugal the chapbooks in English and sent them to the British Library. But full-length book, he only published one. Published a lot in journals, a lot. He started many journals in Portugal, had a publishing house, translated a lot, published many translations too. Just his body of work of published stuff during his lifetime in different magazines and journals is quite something. But book, he only published one very weird and interesting book called Mensagem, Message. It's supposed to be called Portugal, but the last minute one of his friends said in Portugal, the name of the country was being used the word prostitute. Yeah, he had a friend who was crazy. He was living in a crazy house and told him to not use the name of the country because the country didn't deserve it. But Pessoa had already the proofs of the book, and he had to change the title of the book to the same number of characters. So he chose Mensagem, message. In Portuguese, the same characters of Portugal. And this book is the history of Portugal, told in first-person songs by kings and other characters. It's fascinating because in a way it's also what he has done his entire life, making people speak. What is this if not a meta-drama, what he invented? And it's a very interesting book which has been very much studied, but there's not a very good critical edition of it yet. And it's very hard to translate. Jennings also translated it. It translated very well. And one of the poems that Jennings particularly loved was The Monster, O Monstrengo. And I thought that to get a taste of the Portuguese, to have a facsimile version of Monstrengo here. And Pessoa in Portuguese is fabulous writing in Portuguese. It's very hard to recreate, as you can imagine, the rhythm and the rhymes and the internal rhymes, and it's endless, right? Jennings does a very good job. Just to give a sense of the Portuguese, I'll read you the first stanza and then I'll read Jennings' translation. It's short. In Portuguese, O Monstrengo. O monstrengo que está no fim do mar, na noite de breu ergueu-se a voar. A roda da nau voou 3 vezes a chiar e disse: quem é que ousou entrar nas minhas cavernas que não desvendo, meus tetos negros do fim do mundo? E o homem do leme disse tremendo: El Rei Dom João II. I should also say that my accent in Portuguese is Brazilian. I can make the Portuguese accent as well, but I read as if I'm not thinking, my own accent is kind of a crazy Brazilian because I lived in Portugal as well. But anyways, Jennings' translation of the poem is the translation with which he finished a short story I told you about, which is in that book. Short story in which he creates an encounter between Pessoa and Camões at a famous cafe and bar in Portugal called A Brasileira, the Brazilian. If you've ever been to Lisbon, it's a great cafe. So this is the translation by Jennings of The Monster, Monstrengo. The monster who lives at the end of the world rose up in the dark of night to fly. 3 times around the ship it swirled, and thrice was heard its screaming cry. Who is this that dares to come and brave the dreadful vaults of my secret cave? And the man at the helm trembling said, the King, Lord John II. What sails invade my feeding ground? What keels are these I see and hear? 3 times the ship he whirled around, and thrice with crows and filthy leer yelled out the terrifying sound. Who dares what I alone may dare, who live where no other is found, and from the sea pour fathomless fear? The man at the wheel trembled and said, the King, Lord John II. Thrice the helm from his grip was shaken, thrice by his grasping hands retaken, and after trembling thrice he cried, here, at the helm I am more than I am a people seeking from you the wide domain of ocean, and though trembling I feel fear of the monster and the darkening sky, here in the gloom at the end of the world, still the will holds me fast to the will of King Lord John II. You get a feel from Mensagem. And then just to finish, which is not finishing, as you see, if you turn the paper I gave you, we have a manuscript of Pessoa. This is what Norman Pessoa's archive looks like. And Pessoa has been more published posthumously, as for example the Book of Disquiet. Only a few fragments have been published in his lifetime. So Pessoa has published more after he died than while he lived. Way more, like more than 10 to 1 percentage-wise. And you'll find in his archive lots of things and his English poetry is very much unpublished yet. So this is a sonnet, an English sonnet. Believe me, this is a sonnet, first thing, right? This is an actual sonnet, it's a complete sonnet. And I would like you to try to read it with me. I did the first transcription of this and got to publish in a Portuguese Literary Culture Studies with a friend. And his English at the end of his life is very different from his English that I read to you from Joseph Chamberlain. He published a chapbook in English called 35 Sonnets. They're very Shakespearean, but at the end of his life, his English is much more Yeats, Blake, it's simple, it's melodic, it's very interesting, but it's equally philosophical. So who would like to try to read that? We can go slowly in this one, but it's interesting and it's worth reading.
I can do the first line.
Please.
Tell me again this story of the prince.
Okay, so it's a sonnet. Remember, there will be rhymes and meter. Semi-pentameter in this case. Tell me again the story of the prince. Any takers on the second line? I actually don't have, so I'll sit here. So the fairy tale.
Oh, you can have this.
Oh no, please, please. The fairy tale of when I was a child. It cannot now sustain me, nor convince, but it can make my,
Stubborn.
and then sullen under, so you always add it to the last variant. But it can make my sullen soul, it was heart, feel, somebody said it right,
Right? I don't know.
wild, rhyming with child. So that's the first four verses. Then there's a mass, right? The impossible is ours because we
Love.
love. And there's a lot of stuff here. I'll read the small one. Awaking me, I don't know,
Once.
yeah, once more, its sleeping tail. And then there's another variance. And then again, that's a variance, so skip that. That my old heart, its stubborn youth may prove. Who finds, crossed out, and the nose above, who knows the prince may find
Holy Grail.
the Holy Grail. Tell me again the story. He was bold. He fought against bad giants, and at last, that was crossed out, cloistered, that princess cloistered, since old days, old day was old, it's confusing there, was wake by him and won. This is the past. Then there's a lot of versions for the end. I will read the one that is, or will read the one within that he highlighted, right, with a square. What the blind future holds, let us forget. Knowing it or not knowing, we regret. So you can have a sense. Of course, it takes a week to read this the first time, right? But I hope you get a sense of Pessoa of this. So I've been living with him for 10 years now, doing lots of other projects, and got to work on his the first critical edition of Pessoa's Faust. It's another whole story. I'm not even going to get started on it, but it was published in Portuguese, and surprisingly, he wrote in Portuguese, but surprisingly, there's some English poems as well. If anybody's interested, take a look at that. But, I mean, this is it. This is it. All right, and Michael, I don't know if you want to help him for questions, if people want to stand and just talk, what do you recommend?
We can dance.
We
We
can
can.
dance.
I was
We
going
can
to tap
hug.
dance for a few minutes. Birkenstock tap
I
dance.
know, so blood can get flowing again.
Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you.
Are there pressing questions, or we
I
can
have
also?
a question.
Yes.
I have a question.
No, no questions for you.
Shut up. So, it's gonna be a difficult question. Get ready.
Let me do one thing though. I'll move a chair there, so closing here too. Please. Please.
No difficult question.
So Carlos, in all the enthusiasm you have for Pessoa, if you had to put in one word or in a few words, why Pessoa? What would you say? I know this is a very lame question, but I'm
I
curious
think
anyway.
it changes. I think it changes over time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps it started as just fascinating. It's a world. It's a rabbit hole. It's a never ending. Really, it has not been. It's a lot too. It's frustrating. It's a lot of things at the same time. But in Portuguese, I mean, if you want to study Portuguese poetry, it's unavoidable, right?
We learn Pessoa in school. It's
Yeah.
obligatory, so you can't
Yes,
escape it.
it's true. Now in Brazil has been as well for a while now. There's the equivalent to SAT in Brazil now mandates that you read Pessoa, Alberto Caeiro, which is interesting. That was after I took the SAT though. But first time I went to Portugal was it's very very powerful story. It's a long story. I'm not gonna tell now, but how I fell into it. I used to study journalism before I went to Lisbon, and because of Graça and because of Pessoa and because a lot of things just I changed. Of course, got into literature and education after that. But so one last journalist in the world, Pessoa. I don't know if we should clap or not. But now I think it's in a way I get paid to study poetry if you think about it, and you learn. It's quite amazing, and there's something particularly interesting to work with the archives because you can see how he actually wrote it and his decisions and how we make decisions as we write poetry, and that is fascinating to me. It's priceless because you can get kind of we think you can get inside of his head,
yeah.
right, making decisions. But nowadays I feel like it's the opposite. Like sometimes I get mad at him, right? Because like enough, but there's a lot of things that should be done. For example, he wrote drama beautifully, and they haven't been staged because they haven't been even transcribed in English. He has at least 3 plays that are fragmentary or alinear. But we don't know actually because nobody has read them, and there's hundreds and hundreds of pages of it. So like, who's gonna do that? And then if nobody's gonna do it, then I would like to do it. But it's just like 3 more years of your life if you take on one of those things. But at the same time, I have my own writings, which is always a love and hate relationship with Pessoa. I'm not gonna read them, but today at least, and I write mostly in Portuguese as well. But it changes. That's the answer. And now I like neglected projects as well. So projects that people don't pay attention to, as Pessoa's English poetry, interests me. Jennings Archive was neglected for ages, so it's another project. I'm working at Brown now with online archives as well, things that people are not paying attention to. I don't know why. I like the underdogs, so I guess, even though Pessoa is not, but their sides of Pessoa are definitely underdogs, like his English poetry.
I got a question or statement. So, Chloe, right? So thank you so much for introducing me to an artist from an age when metaphor seemed more real or part of, because we live in such a literal or material literal age.
Yeah.
What's the word? Not literal, maybe.
Yeah. That makes sense to me.
Yeah, surface, right? And I know a little about for the classical Chinese, that sometimes the poet would construct like 3 poems in one, where you could read it 3 different ways because the characters were so rich and so. Did you come across anything like that when you were?
He didn't really write in that form, but what he does do that I try to maintain is that every poem can be broken into stanzas, and then every line can be broken into its own stanza, and there's parallelism going on several different levels. So I couldn't ring over the rhyme, because it wasn't, but what I did try to do was bring over that form.
Yeah, right.
So put a lot of that so you could feel it. And in the book I broke them open a little bit so that you could really see the work that was going on. I hope.
Yeah.
I heard some internal rhymes when you were reading, though. I don't know if it imagining that.
Yeah,
but-
yes, no,
but,
they did,
yeah.
I mean, I wanted it to have a good sound in
Mhm.
English, good mouthfeel.
Mhm.
But well, the most important thing for me is his imagery, the very strange things that pop up. And I wanted to make sure that those were crystal clear to the reader, that the reader could see those, and then over that I could put the skin of the mouthfeel.
But that's why, they say traduttore traditore, right?
Yes.
Or the translation is approximation at best, because you
Yeah.
always have to put emphasis on one thing, but you're always going to lose something. You're like trying to
You're always
hold
gonna
sand.
lose.
There's always, okay,
Yeah.
what am I going to bring up to the surface?
Yeah, and I just feel like you have to be honest about, I always try to be like, this was a priority,
Mhm.
because really, as you move down your list of priorities, then things start to get lost, so that someone can know when I was translating it, this is what
Mhm.
I focus on bringing over. And then, this edition also has translations by a sinologist, English sinologist who died, and a contemporary scholar and translator who lives in Hong Kong. So, and they focus on different aspects of his work, so you can kind of see the whole thing. Yeah.
It would actually be wonderful to bring those together and
Yeah.
then read the same poem translated differently with different like a mirror.
Yeah.
It would be cool.
That's the hope, that you can kind of do that, because not one of us gets the whole thing.
Mhm.
You know.
Do you speak Chinese?
I used to be pretty fluent in it.
So you could sound out the poems as you were
Yes.
working on them?
Since I've had kids, it's gotten a little bad, but it's still, I can still, correspond with people in China and read it, and it's still there, so I gotta get them back up.
In Pessoa's world, we say now transcrittore e traditore, because when you transcribe, sometimes the words are ambiguous, so you kind of project also what you want them to be
Yeah.
in some cases, and this has happened a lot. So there are fights, endless fights over one word in Pessoa's world. So I got to write an essay called Transcrittore e Traditore, talking about some of those fights recently. I had fun, because there was one poem that was read as, transcribed as the cripple with desire. Like, doesn't make any difference. Like, the cripple with desire? Like, who
With
transcribed
cripple
it?
with desire?
The cripple with desire. So in the end, I'm like, what the heck is that? And I went to the manuscript. It was the nipple with desire. He's talking about a baby. He's talking about a baby. The nipple with desire. Like, he wants to transcend the nipple with desire. He was talking about it's the image of a baby. It's like obvious after you see it. And then I sent a mail to the people that had transcribed it. Like, you're crazy. You're obsessed with press. Like, what are you talking about? Like, not obsessed. It's like, and then, of course, and then because they were so reluctant, and then I wrote the essay, and then they're even madder at me now because I don't get to see those guys read Crip. But there's several examples of that, and it's quite interesting what happens. And so there's that layer too of transcriptions in Pessoa's world, and it's hard. It's hard, and I wonder, into what if that happens also, because handwriting in Chinese is so
Yeah.
personal, right?
And so it does, so most Chinese poems come embedded with footnotes by scholars through the years. So, and in some cases, they will write, this character that you're reading in the original is incorrect. You should actually be using this one, he's referencing this poem. In most cases, I just translated the original text, but there were some where it had to be incorrect because it didn't make sense, so then I would use, but yes,
It's
there's,
interesting.
yeah, and it comes along of a piece, all of the scholars' commentaries is part of the work, but I didn't, it's at one point do you draw the border around it, but yeah, I ran into that all the time.
We also have plenty of time to talk to our poets. Please grab them, give them wine first.
And then crippled with the nipple.
Anyway, no nibble. A couple of last notes. There are books here for sale. You can see me or Isabel, and we'll get money arranged. for
How
you.
much are they? We don't
They're
know.
$10,000 each. They're signed, unsigned. How much were you going for?
Mine's 15,
And yours?
and I'm
What do
happy
you
to
say?
sign it.
I don't want to sound like it's more, but
It's got a picture on the cover.
okay.
The other thing, if you miss the money bowl, that money goes to the poets. Please donate if you can. And we're back on the 9th of December with Fanny Howe in the afternoon, 3 o'clock. And thank you to both of you and all of you for inviting us this long. Please eat and drink.